This is week 7 in our study of Dr. Truman's book, Strange New World. I think there's actually one more regular class period next week before we start our summer schedule. I believe that's correct. And this is week 7. So some of the first chapters of the book took multiple weeks. So our study week here doesn't exactly coincide with the chapters in the book. We're actually in chapter 6 of the book. And there are 9 chapters in the book. So if you do the math real quick, we're not going to do 3 chapters next week. So the plan is that this study will spill over into the summer schedule. And so, welcome everyone to keep returning as we keep studying the book and finish out the book. And just to make note, keep in mind that the only difference will be a time change. Class will be at 8:15, I believe, instead of 9:15. So it'll be a sacrifice of an hour in the morning. But it's been an interesting study, a fascinating study, and as Pastor Kevin and I have talked, we think it's a very pertinent study, especially for the times that we're living in and the things that we're seeing. So, did everyone get a handout? If you didn't get a handout, I believe there's still some on the table back there. So if you need one, raise your hand. Mark will get you one. But I think everyone probably got one. So this week's lesson, or this week's chapter, is called Plastic People, Liquid World. And at the top of the handout, our purpose, again, just to restate this, and this is a phrase that the author has used quite frequently. This question, how does a statement like, I'm a woman trapped inside a man's body, come to be a legitimate statement in our modern society? And not just, and that's kind of generalized. The book is not just focusing on transgenderism. It does address the entire LGBTQ plus community, that range. But the transgenderism seems to be maybe the current hot topic, or the issue of the day. And as Christians, how do we navigate this strange new world as our mission field? So just to keep those in mind, that's the purpose when we cover these lessons. Again, the title is Plastic People, Plastic World for this chapter. This is actually connected to the previous chapter, because a section of the previous chapter was entitled From a Fixed World to a Plastic World. And now we're going to a liquid world. So it's the idea of, and when we talk about plastic, it's not talking about something cheap made out of plastic. It's the idea of being moldable. It's changeable. So we went from a fixed world to a changeable world, and now this week we're going to a liquid world. We're moving from something that was moldable to something that has no shape and free-flowing. And of course, this is by design. So when we look at our list of key figures there, and I'm not going to go through the details of these, but just to keep in mind or to understand the progression, and that's why it's interesting to have the dates on these key figures, because excluding Augustine and probably Descartes, although that's on the fence, but excluding Augustine, these key figures, these key influencers go from maybe something like deism, that, well, there might be a God, but he's not an involved God. He's not a personal God, and therefore he's not all that relevant. And even that kind of denying of God, they still looked into natural law to understand morality, that there was still a source of morality. But then as we progress down through history, each of these influencers get a little bit more aggressive. And then you get to Nietzsche, who really calls out the Enlightenment thinkers and said, well, Nietzsche says, if you're going to, if God's not going to be relevant, let's go all the way. God's dead. And you should live your life as if God is dead and that you yourself are the only God. And then we, again, take another step in progressivism with Freud and the sexual revolution. And then even with William Reich, combining Freud and Marxism and creating an attack on the family. The family is the problem. The family is the source of power and control in society, and that we need to break that. We need to get rid of that. So that's a little bit of a picture of how we're diving into this liquid world. That there was maybe some stability, but it was moldable all the way to the point of there's nothing solid left. And then we've included in the handout there some brief descriptions of keystone moments in history. I won't go through all those. We've kind of covered those. But last week, as I mentioned, we looked at the idea of a fixed world transforming into a plastic world, something, again, that could be molded and shaped to suit our will. So previously, meaning last week's lesson, just for a quick review, the fixed world to a plastic world, this is the idea of the transition of societal structures from singular and stable to fractured and changeable. So we have to ask ourselves, how did this happen? How is it that the world is now something more moldable? And there's really a couple of major contributing factors. One we looked at, the collapse of traditional authority structures. And the second is an advancing technology. The fracturing of the church, and of course, we know that we can say this began with the Great Schism, the fracturing of the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. But it really took off with the Protestant Reformation. It's interesting, I was listening to a book review of this book, and the book reviewer had many good things to say about the book. He agreed with everything that was in the book, but the only criticism he had at the end was that Dr. Truman does not go far enough in blaming the Protestant Reformation for our current situation. And then right away it dawned on me, I'm listening to a Catholic review this book. But there is a point there that when the church fractured, so you had this kind of singular authority structure, that if there was still a singular authority structure and you had groups or communities like the LGBTQ plus community demanding affirmation, that authority structure could just say no, and that would be it. But we went from a single authority structure of the Catholic Church to now we have hundreds. And it was interesting, Pastor Kevin, one of his anecdotal statements was, somebody, I can't remember exactly how he was related or knew them, but these parents, their 11-year-old daughter came to them and said, I was either bisexual or homosexual at 11. And the father was, his response was, we probably need to change churches. So that's where we're at in a plastic world, that it's moldable. If we don't like this or that church, we just head down the road to the next one. This perpetuates the idea that there is no real singular authority in the church, just commercialized programs to choose from. Then you have postmodernism and the loss of appealing to transcendence. Postmodernism is the movement or the thinking that's critical or denies or tries to destroy tradition. Traditions are the bad things, the mindless things. And then the appealing to transcendence, there's the loss of sacred order, that at the very least appealing to natural law. Well, not only the modern thinking is, well, that's foolish. Only fools would appeal to natural law for morality. There's nothing greater than what? Ourselves, right? That's the modern thinking. What's exacerbated this? Technology has done an amazing amount to make the world more moldable. Of course, that's a catch-22 because that's what it's for. I really like technology. I like air conditioning. I like cars. I like being able to get from one point to another. But those things, there are downsides to everything. The car, I mean, again, like I mentioned, we'd just drive to a different church. In ancient times, that never happened. You went to whatever church you could walk or ride a horse to. Nowadays, we have plenty of options, and we can get to any of them. The book talks about birth control as far as the sexual revolution. Birth control, the technology of birth control allows the change of being able to indulge in sex for just merely pleasure and without responsibility. Pornography. We talked a little bit about that last time. I was just going to add, to understand, to get a kind of a grasp of that and how that changes society. The Japanese culture, the Japanese people are dying. They have a negative population growth. And one of the factors, they state, one of the factors is pornography. People aren't interested in actual physical relationships anymore. They seek fulfillment in these other venues. And it's stopping the coupling of men and women, and it's stopping the birth of children. Another thing to put in perspective, I heard this not too long ago. I thought this was a fascinating statement, and I was listening to a lecture by Jordan Peterson, Dr. Jordan Peterson, and he stated, today's world, any 12-year-old boy has access to see more beautiful nude women than the wealthiest kings in all of human history. Now that has to change a society, right? And then we talked about the sexual revolution, and sex has become more moldable and fluid. It can be whatever we want it to be. So this next chapter, chapter 6, plastic people, liquid world. Our culture is one of people that believe they can remake themselves at will. So people are moldable too now. But what is it that they're remaking? What is a person? What gives a person identity? If you think back to the first class, we had an exercise to write down who you are. You wrote down some items or descriptions of who you are. If you were here, you did that, but is that our true identity? And this becomes a much more existential question. What is it that makes us each, what makes us unique? What makes us us? Are we merely just the stuff we're made out of? Does anyone have a thought or opinion on that? What would a secularist person say? How would they answer that? Maybe yeah. Sure. Maybe you ask it, what makes you unique as a person? What makes me me and not Ben? I'm better looking? Was that it?
Each person is kind of the center of their own universe.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, right. 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 Yeah. So yeah, and it's difficult for us, as Christians with a Christian worldview. It's difficult for us to get away from, and kind of think outside of that. But if we think as a Darwinist, what does a Darwinist think makes a person unique? Or maybe they're not unique. Our genetic code, yeah. So our genetic code, a materialist can point to a genetic code and say, well, you're unique. You're the only one that has that genetic code, or fingerprints, something like that. But the existentialist question is more like who versus what. So who are you? What do you give priority to the things that make up your identity? We mentioned, from a Christian worldview, Bob mentioned God has made us unique. So from a Christian standpoint, is that the highest priority that makes up our identity? And maybe what would a secularist person say is the highest priority? Maybe it's what we've been talking about in this book, right? It's what I feel inside. I was born a man, but I feel like a woman. So that becomes the highest priority. Do we decide our identity in a vacuum? Are you completely free to decide who you are, to decide your identity? No, maybe not totally. We do have a lot of freedom. we're going to talk about genealogy here. So the idea that what do they say? You can't pick your relatives. You can pick your friends, but you can't pick your relatives, or something like that. But you may not be able to pick your relatives. You may not have that freedom, but you have the freedom to engage with your relatives or not engage. How important is lineage to identity? In the Bible, of course, there's lots of genealogies in the Bible. So lineage is important in the ancient world. Who you are is very dependent on where you came from. What about in our modern world? Well, that's true. Yeah. So maybe this is a bad area to ask that question.
Concerted effort to diminish that.
Diminish the importance of genealogies or lineage? Yeah. Yeah, so the Norwegian or Scandinavian heritage aside, that our world, when the divorce rate is over 50%, there's so many broken homes that maybe our genealogy, our lineage is not that important. We remake our identities from other things other than family. Yep. Hmm? Yeah, that's a good point. So it's instead of basing my identity off of maybe something like genealogy, lineage, a line of where I've come from, I ignore that because I maybe don't like that. And again, it's this turn inward. So it's this feeling, putting feelings as the most important thing, and then how do you express that outwardly? And that's expressing it, usually through imagery, because our identity is in dialogue with our community. So it seems that we have some freedom to choose our identities, but freedoms within certain boundaries, and those boundaries are the time and place that we're living. What are some examples of rebellion in an effort to be free to define one's own identities? And that, you answered some of those, right? The appearance, clothes, music. The music that everyone in here listened to as a teenager, did your parents hate? It's a continuous cycle, right, throughout history. Maybe where we live. What are some of the examples of rebelling into conformity? How do you rebel into conformity? Yeah, teenagers are a perfect example of that. So a teenager that is going to rebel against their parents' generation, I'm going to wear what I want to wear. I'm going to wear these different clothes and look different, and piercings and tattoos. And then the generation of that teenager, what's happening? They're all doing the same thing, and they all end up looking the same. So they're rebelling into conformity. I attended, some years ago, I attended the Auto Week Designers Forum in Detroit, Michigan for the Detroit Auto Show. So I was in a room of 500 designers. Now these are like car designers and everything. These are the people that are the creative types, the innovators, the people that come up with the original ideas. And I was stunned because you had 500 people all dressed identical. They were all dressed in identical type clothing. And it dawned on me that they're rebelling into conformity, that they're dressing for their community. That was the uniform of their community. And we're going to get into the idea of community here in a little bit. Why do people have a strong need to belong? Any ideas on that? Why do we need to belong to something? Comfort? A humanist or anthropologist may say, well, it helps with survival, right? You group up for a better chance of survival. But we are social creatures and we thrive best when we're connected to others. That seems to be, the general case. When people don't do that, we have a name for them. They're called sociopaths. It's a mental disorder. When people have oppose belonging to community. The politics of recognition. So this is the idea of, and recognition meaning this is your identity is being affirmed by a community, and therefore you have membership in this community. All these designers all dressing the same at this forum. They all fit in. They all. It was a badge of their membership in this community. What are some of the rebelling into conformity? Yeah. 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 Well, yeah. Generally, what starts as rebellion becomes the norm. In a certain sense, like especially with music, where you have some avant-garde music, and it's like, oh, that's, and then pretty soon it's kind of accepted. And these designers at this forum I was at, their dress, in a way, was rebelling, because these are designers at car companies. They weren't dressed like the executives at the car companies. They were dressed different, but they were all dressed the same. And all the executives dressed the same. They're all wearing suits and ties. That's their uniform of their community. That shows their membership in that community. So when we look at what are required behaviors to be recognized as a member of a nation, how do you have to behave to be a legitimate member of a nation? Obeying the laws, sure, yeah. Generally, you're generally patriotic. You support the nation that you're a member of. What about a family? What's proper behavior to be a member of a family? Obey the laws of the family, right? Yeah. Supporting your family. What's that? Committed to your family. I don't know if anyone's told their children, if you don't behave, you're out of this family. I'm not the only one that said that. A church. What is proper behavior to be a member of a church? Maybe dressing like this. I don't. Any thoughts there? How about attending? I really can't be a member of a church. I'm not attending. I'm attending here. I feel like a member of this community. I'm not attending the other churches in town right now. I'm not part of their community. What are some behaviors that would exclude a person from being a member of a nation? Being a traitor. Yeah, traitorous action. A family. Maybe we answered that. Misbehaving, right? As far as these community. Yep. Right. Sure. Yeah, so what would exclude you from a church? Blasphemy? Yeah. Heretical views, heretical teaching. Lifestyle? Unrepentant sin? Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Do those change over time? Are there behaviors that change? Behaviors that are acceptable at one point in time, and I would even say that's true. So I've been working at Articat for 30 years. I've seen that. There's things now that we can't do or say that we could maybe a couple decades ago. Yeah. Yeah. What are the consequences of recognition being denied? That could probably go all the way from disappointment to someone, especially someone that feels their identity is being denied. That can be anger and rage. And when we talk about communities and belonging to a group, what are some of the communities that you belong to? You belong to the community of Thief River? Or thereabouts? This church where you work? Then we get into something, how we define these communities, especially when we look at something like a nation. How do you end up belonging to a community of a nation? So, and here's the example. Here we live about 70 miles or so from the Canadian border. We're closer to Canada than we are to Texas. But as a nation, how do we have a national connection, more of a connection to the people in southern Texas than we do to Canada? So it's not necessarily geography, right? it's geography in the sense that there's a geopolitical border, that inside this border is something, outside that border is something else. So what ties us together? Liberty. Okay, so liberty, and in that sense, there's a national story. There's a narrative here of the story of this nation. And if to be part of that community, then we connect with that story. That story is part of us, or we adopt that story. It's the same with a family. How do you be a member of a family? This family versus that family. Well, there's a narrative there. There's a story. I was born into that family. These are the parents that raised me. This is, I'm the husband of so-and-so. I'm the wife of so-and-so. The church, you mentioned that. You mentioned the common beliefs, the common biblical beliefs that tie us together. With the collapse of authority of traditional communities, with what communities are they replaced? How is it that a young person in Indiana, in the United States, in Indiana, can go online and pledge allegiance to ISIS? To that person, they've decided to not be. And it doesn't matter where they're at. Geographically, it doesn't matter where they're at. They have decided that they're not going to be a member of the community of this nation. They're going to be a member of this other organization that's on the other side of the world.
The distinction between a nation
Mm-hmm.
which means a group of people born with the same nature.
Mm-hmm.
We get our word nature and born rather.
Mm-hmm.
And so really a nation is a group of people born with the same characteristics. Like you think of Japan as a nation, but also it's a state, so it's a nation state.
Right.
But you think of like the nation of Israel, they're scattered out all over across the world, right? They're still the Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the Jewish nation, but they don't live within a certain tax jurisdiction.
Yeah.
You know, so is there a danger in conflating those two?
Well, what's interesting is the book, when the book talks about it, the book always talks about nation state.
Okay.
So like in the sense of the Jews, especially in the diaspora, when they're scattered, what was the common thread? There's, again, geographically, they weren't together,
Sure.
but their common thread was their heritage, the Bible, their beliefs. So they maintained that community, membership in that community. The author talks about, he talks quite a bit about the technology that's arisen that allows things, other options than what was maybe available in the past. And those other options are, well, if I don't like the nation that I'm in, even physically, I can feel like I can join another community, maybe across the world. And it's things like the internet, it's things like technology that have allowed that. When the traditional community, the authority of the traditional community of the family collapses, what takes its place? Social groups, yeah. Cults, yeah. Gangs. They often talk about gangs as being like family. What about church? When the traditional authority structure of the church falls, what does it get replaced by? Maybe cults again. What about parachurches and televangelists? There's many people today that feel that they can sit in their home and watch a televangelist and feel Well, I'm part of that community. And, maybe in a sense they're fooling themselves a bit. Unfortunately, we might not be able to look up all these Bible references, but for our conclusions here, the biblical concept of personhood, what are we? Well, what are we? We're made out of the dust of the ground, right? That's in Genesis. So that is what we are made of. Who are we? What does the Bible say who we are or where our identities are derived from? Where are our identities derived from? Yeah. Yeah, the Imago Dei. Pastor Kevin mentioned that. The biblical concept of recognition. Were we created to be recognized? What is the biblical concept of recognition? Let's see. We'll go to Ephesians 1:4. Even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him in love. Do you have it? Okay. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, so the biblical concept is we were chosen. So we are recognized. Not by our own merit or anything special about us. What makes us special is that we're chosen. The biblical concept of community. What was the first community in all of existence? Eden? So which one? The Adam and Eve? The Trinity. Yeah, that Adam and Eve is the second one. So the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have always been in community. They have always been in communion with each other. And then being made in the image of God, you have Adam and Eve kind of replicating that communion, that family. So what is the biblical concept of community? Does anyone have 1 Corinthians? If I beat 1 Corinthians 12:13, if I beat you to it, I'll read it.
I got it.
Okay.
For in one spirit we were all baptized into one body.
Okay, so in that sense, outside of the Spirit creating community in us, this modern conception of the inner feelings creating identity, does that matter? Does it matter in a Christian worldview? No, the only thing that matters is the Spirit creating the community. So people are created with certain God-ordained desires, an understanding of who they are, recognition or affirmation, a sense of belonging in a community. And we find complete fulfillment in those desires in God alone. But when people are moldable, when we come to this concept of moldable or the world being liquid because of the collapse of traditional authorities, it's not that people abandon their desires. They still have those desires. Instead, the world will invent any non-biblical, twisted idea to fill that void, to fill that desire. And I think this is key in the formation of the LGBT community. No one, I'll go on a limb. No one in the LGBT community, if you go back to the front page of the handout, that list of philosophers and doctors, nobody reads those guys. Nobody's read those guys and said, oh yeah, I like what Rousseau said, I'm going to be a transgender. That doesn't happen. What happens is that the traditional authority structure, also, nobody's been debated into being homosexual. And nobody gets argued into that. So how does somebody join that community? How do they get there? The traditional authority structure collapse, nation, family, church, and that perennial need to belong still persists. New anchor points for one's identity are searched out. And really, these are most commonly, we find these in art and entertainment and the social influencers that become the de facto representative of these imagined communities. The person ends up being wooed into one community or another. They pick their team because they've felt something. Again, this is all about the inner feelings. So they've felt something, and that sounded good to them, and they could be part of a community, and they could get their desire of belonging fulfilled. But just to end, I like what C.S. Lewis wrote. There is but one good, that is God. Everything else is good when it looks to him, and bad when it turns from him. And we're out of time. Any other thoughts or comments about... Yeah. Okay. Yep.
He fits all those things of having strong nation, strong family.
Yeah.
How then does he still have that void he needs to fill?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and it's very complicated. And, our lives are the sum of, almost an infinite number of details. Where he became influenced, maybe who can say? There obviously was an influence at some point where a thought was created, and, that thought, and maybe, instead of, is he a believer? If a person is the upbringing for it, yeah. So in that sense, it's easy to say, well, if they're not a believer, they still don't have that anchor point of God and the Bible and God's law to say this is right or this is wrong. If you were to say he was a believer, well, then that's way more complicated, and I wouldn't begin to be able to explain that. But it's hard to say. It's hard, and maybe the point of it is it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much to, one little influence can implant a thought that grows and grows and grows, and then you end up with this other identity belonging to other communities. Conviction? Conviction?
Yeah,
You can,
where you get to the point again where
yeah.
you turn back to the truth.
Yeah.
God's authority.
And it also, can serve as an example of the spiritual warfare that we're in. It's the enemy is really clever, really subtle. I remember I quit here, but I remember I was thinking as I was going through this, I was, how do you end up in these communities? How these influencers? Again, nobody's reading, Nietzsche and coming up with this decision. It's other things. And I was thinking, I remember back in the 90s when, cross-dressing was, not very common. And I remember the entertainer RuPaul. I don't know if any of you are familiar with RuPaul. He's a cross-dresser and an entertainer. And he was pretty good at it. I mean, he was what would you say? He was what?
Passable?
He was passable, yeah. He wasn't ugly. Maybe he made a better looking woman than a man, but and he was, he was entertaining and he was funny. And I thought, wow, that was back then. That was setting the stage, making this acceptable, making it palatable. Yeah.
In Jonathan Cahn's latest book,
Yeah.
the only thing is, since the people
Yeah. The
devil and his demons,
demonic spirits. That,
yeah, and that was his, he gives that.
yeah. Interesting. Yeah. There's spiritual warfare. It's part of it. So we're over time. Let me close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you. We thank you and praise you for who you are, and we thank you and praise you for this time that we could spend together. We thank you and praise you for this community of believers that can come together to worship you, to study your word, to glorify you. We just ask for a blessing upon it. We thank you for this time and the material that we could look at. We ask for your guidance in navigating this strange new world, and navigating it as Christians and doing the work that you would have us do. Again, I thank you for each one here. I ask for a blessing upon us as we go forth into the week. And we ask for a blessing upon our service ahead, those that are preaching and leading us in worship. And may our worship be acceptable to you, Lord. And may you be glorified. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.